Hello, everyone, and welcome to All Things Breastfeeding podcast with LactaLearning. I'm Barbara Robertson, and I'm your host for the podcast. And I'm joined today by our co-founder, LactaLearning's co-founder, Nancy Mohrbacher. Hello, Nancy.
Good morning, Barbara. Good to see you.
Good to see you. And so we have coming up, well, Nancy and I are working on Breastfeeding Answers, third edition. We
Mhm.
just finished our first draft of um, our chapter on pumping and milk expression. And this kind of led Nancy to be thinking about talks. And she's actually going to be doing a talk at ILCA,
Mhm.
2025 ILCA conference about
Right.
exclusive pumping. And I was like, well, Nancy, that's a podcast.
Yeah,
Let's talk about the latest research on exclusive pumping. So thank you for joining us, and let's get into it.
sure.
So let's start out with people who are exclusive pumpers. How do
Mhm.
people become exclusive pumpers? There's definitely some people who are like, I'm going to be an exclusive pumper. This is my plan.
Right.
But
Right.
then there's a lot of people that wasn't their plan. So let's talk about that.
Yeah. Well, the history of it is the first research we have on, how many, what percentage do it and who they are came in the mid 2000s, so
Hmm.
around 2005. And what the study showed was that primarily those who were exclusively pumping were pumping for preterm babies who had not made the transition to direct nursing. But
Hmm.
this has changed dramatically since then.
Right.
So we have a wonderful integrative review of 27 studies on exclusive pumping that was just published this year in 2025. And it found that the primary person who's exclusively pumping is someone who began with the idea they were going to breastfeed, but
Right.
ran into breastfeeding problems.
Hmm. Yeah. And this has been my experience. So when you shared that
Mhm.
research, I'm like, well, this is my life. In
Yes,
my private practice, we have a
yes,
lot of people who wanted to nurse
right,
directly and for whatever reason ended up being exclusive pumpers.
right, right.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I think what's interesting for a lot of these women, primarily women,
Mhm.
it's they find their breastfeeding experience traumatizing
Yeah.
because it was very upsetting to them. They had intended to breastfeed, but for whatever reason, it wasn't working. Sometimes it was latching struggles. One study found that mothers in the study, it was like a interview study, and they found that the many of the mothers were very uncertain about how much milk their baby was getting and found that to be very, very difficult. And that led them to exclusive pumping.
Right, because we already know that worries about milk supply in the first place is a huge reason parents stop breastfeeding.
Right.
But then when we've had a traumatizing experience and the natural worry that seems to come with that. And I
Right.
think also, too, if we don't have a good lactation support person
Right.
who can explain what happened,
Right.
then it feels like a big out of control mystery
Right.
as
Right.
to why it didn't work out.
And fatigue was another reason. And some of these were mothers who were like trying to nurse all night long,
Mm.
trying every time the baby was going to feed, they're trying, but they're having latching struggles. And so they look back on their breastfeeding experience as being horrible,
Yeah.
something that they don't want to repeat. And they feel actually that exclusive pumping gives them more control over several aspects of their lives. First of all, they can see how much the baby's getting. They don't have to be the one doing all the night feedings.
Mhm.
And they have more flexibility to be gone at feeding times.
Right. So the baby's getting optimal nutrition.
Right,
It's just that the parent is one step away from
right.
the
And
process.
I think what's important about this information is that oftentimes when mothers go to lactation consultants, those of us who, value breastfeeding, direct breastfeeding, will spend time trying to convince them that it's worth
Mm.
trying again. And rather than being convincing, I think what happens is many of these mothers feel that lactation specialists are unsupportive,
Right.
that they don't want to go back to that, but they feel like they keep pushing it, and
Mhm.
that they feel very negatively about that. And also
Right.
other healthcare providers, they say doctors don't even acknowledge exclusive pumping as an option and
Mm.
they act as if that isn't really a real thing.
Yeah. And so I think the question when a family comes in of,
Mhm.
well, what are your goals
Right,
is an
exactly.
important
Mhm.
question. But if
Right,
their goals are, I want to be a successful exclusive pumper,
right,
that is what we need to support.
right. And
Yeah.
I did a survey back in 1996 of 10 mothers who were exclusively pumping at that time.
Mhm.
And I learned from working with those women that a lot of them went to lactation people, and when they said what they wanted to do, the first thing they got was trying to convince them not to do it.
Mhm.
So
Yep.
they would just, if they were on the phone, they would hang up the phone and call somebody. They just kept looking for someone who was actually going to help them. And so I learned that the very first thing I needed to say in order to be a support person was, I can help you. I have the information you need to make this work. And
Yep.
once we established that and that I was willing to help them meet their goals, then it was okay to like say, just so
Mhm.
you know,
Right.
it is a lot more time and effort than direct breastfeeding.
Yeah.
Just want to make sure, that, and not to repeat that over and over, but maybe have one conversation where you talk about maybe,
Mhm.
it is possible to transition back to direct breastfeeding later if they feel like they want to do that. Making sure they have that information, but not just keep harping on it.
Right. I've had the opposite too with a family who came in and they exclusively pumped with their first baby and they
Mhm.
absolutely don't want to pump with their second baby.
Yes. Oh,
So it
sure.
can go the opposite. So again,
Yeah.
Nancy and I are huge fans of communication
Mhm.
and really just checking in and asking open-ended questions to find out what the family really wants.
Right. That is critical.
Okay, well, the research on exclusive pumping has exploded.
It has.
We used to not have very much. So, talk a
Mhm.
little bit about when we dove into the research, what were the
Mhm.
things that you found?
Well, we've made certain recommendations around exclusive pumping for
Mm.
many years, myself included.
Yeah.
And usually these were based on what's normal for a breastfeeding baby. So, for example, the idea that you want to be pumping at least 8 times a day in the beginning has been our go-to
I
recommendation
think it still is. I think
for a
that's
very,
still
very
what we
long
would
time.
suggest. Hmm.
But what I'm seeing in the research is that that's not always necessary.
Hmm.
That pumping is a different thing from breastfeeding, and that many mothers can be successful, in a different way that's not quite so overwhelming. And I think that that's really, really critical
Hmm.
for making, human milk feedings available for example, babies in the NICU,
Yeah.
but also for these mothers, who are at home and want to make exclusive pumping work.
Hmm.
Understand what is the minimum that needs to happen in order for milk production to be established and maintained. I think is a really important aspect of this.
Yeah, so, this is a wondering question. Why do you feel like the pumping is so different than nursing? Because with nursing, where we want that baby to breast,
Mhm.
8 to 12 times per 24 hours. But with
Mhm.
some of the studies, they found as few as
Mhm.
could be 5 milk removals in 24 hours could be enough. So what do you think's going on there?
Well, I mean, first of all, with a baby, a newborn isn't always super effective right at the
That's
beginning.
true, right? Yes.
And babies have very small stomachs and they can't take in very much, whereas a pump actually can express more milk, maybe
Right.
than
Up to
it could
20
take.
ounces or, whatever, right?
Yeah, I mean, so there are technical differences, if you will, between
Yeah,
a baby and a pump.
yeah.
Um, so I think what we're starting to learn is
Mm.
what are the parameters for pumping that may be different from a baby who's breastfeeding.
It's interesting. If Nancy, you're rocking my world here a little bit because this is something I haven't really thought about. But basically, from the beginning, a
Hmm.
pump can take a full feed or two
Right.
from the breast versus a baby, they take what would we can
A little
a
bit.
quarter of a feed, a fifth
Right.
of a feed, a third of a
Right.
feed more
Right.
frequently.
Right.
And pump technology has changed so much that, we
Mhm.
used to say, oh, a baby's always better at draining the breast than
Yeah.
a pump, but now that's
Not
not
anymore. Yeah.
true,
Yeah.
right?
Not anymore. Not anymore.
Yeah. And so
Yeah.
really between the technology, so very, very interesting. So 5 good milk removals,
Well, well, what
for some people.
There have been a number of studies from different parts of the world that have really honed in on what is this minimum number that's
Mhm.
necessary.
Yeah.
And what I was struck by, like the three places that I was especially noticing were China, the UK, and the
Mm-hmm.
US.
Mm-hmm.
And in the US, we've actually developed some new technologies around determining milk increase or what secretory activation. That's when the, after, usually around the third or fourth day, the milk
Mm-hmm.
increases
Right.
after birth. Some call it lactogenesis too. We now have technologies that can use components in the milk to
Mm-hmm.
determine when this process takes place.
This
Uh,
is fascinating.
yeah,
And
it is.
so they're called biomarkers, you said,
The
breast.
milk biomarkers, right? There's
Yeah.
certain components in the milk that change when milk
Mhm.
increase or secretory activation occurs.
Right.
So there's a number of them, and they're developing point of care devices that can be used at the bedside. They use only 1 milliliter of
Oh,
milk.
good. So
And
drop.
they
Lets
and
them
so
drop.
what's also happened is that they've been rather than just determining once when milk increase or secretory activation occurs, the researchers are able to do measure these things daily or even more often than that. And what they've discovered is that for mothers, for example, in the U.S., who some of the mothers in those studies have health issues and maybe their pumping isn't really up to where it needs to be in the beginning because they have to see their doctor and things like that.
Hmm.
Um, that if the pumping falls off for a day,
Hmm.
that actually they lose that secretory activation. But if they start pumping more often the next day, then they can regain it. And this seems to happen only within the first week after childbirth. So that's something we never even knew
Right.
that secretory activation can happen and then it can you know, reverse, and
Right.
then it can happen again.
Hmm.
So that's totally new information.
So in practical terms, basically, they would start to see more milk, but then maybe a little
Right.
less milk, but then a
But-
little more
Right.
milk. Right. Okay.
Right. So yeah. So it used to be we would only gauge secretory activation by did the mothers feel fuller? The mother's perception of milk increase was considered reliable,
Hmm.
or were they able to pump like if they're
Right.
double pumping at least 20 milliliters or
Hmm.
more at a pumping session? Those were the two ways we used to be able to gauge it, but nobody ever went back and checked to see if this secretory activation stayed stable. In
Hmm.
one study from the US that looked at these women with at least three health conditions that could affect lactation, they found only 41% of them were able to maintain secretory activation for the whole 14 days of the
Hmm.
study.
Hmm.
Most of them did have this reversal take place, and then they were able to bring it back again. But again, only during the first week. We're now, some of the research is showing, we used to say the first 2 weeks were
Hmm.
the really critical window, but now we're realizing there's a number of studies that have shown this, that it's really the first week after birth that is the super critical period.
Well, and again, this is, I think, nature's way, biology's way for a sleepy baby. They might have a sleepy day, but then
Mhm.
oh, they wake up and they can pick it back up again.
Mhm.
So, this redundancy that we have in our bodies to make sure things are
Mhm.
going to work.
Right.
So fascinating that we have
Yeah.
actual research about this.
But one of the studies that really struck me was one that was done in the US, where the researchers actually looked at all the research on exclusive pumping for babies in the NICU. And they discovered that really, basically, no one in any of the studies was successfully pumping 8 times a day,
Mm,
except maybe a few outliers. And so, they said to themselves, well, this is this, this is what we're saying, but nobody's really achieving this.
right.
You know,
Nobody's actually doing it.
in fact, in one study that I was looking at from the UK, where they have paid maternity leave, and this particular study was mostly middle class white mothers,
Mhm.
only 11% of them got to 8 pump sessions a day. But
Yeah.
actually, 6 to 7 pump sessions a day were enough to reach
Mhm.
full milk production for these
Mhm.
mothers. But the ones who had previously breastfed for at least 6 months were much more likely to be able to get there at 6 to 7 pump sessions. So that I thought was really, really interesting. So
So,
yeah, if it, I'd like to talk a little bit about Claire Eden and what she published in the Journal of Human Lactation.
Yeah, but let me go back to the previous point. So what you're
Okay.
saying is some parents will need to pump 8 times per 24 hours to achieve
That
a full milk supply?
Well, okay, first of all,
Yeah.
there's two different criteria. Full
Right.
milk supply is one, but there's another like 500 to 750 milliliters is what you're shooting for.
Okay.
500 milliliters a day is what many of the researchers are calling coming to volume. And
Okay.
what it's been linked to is for babies in the NICU, that's linked to receiving mother's milk at discharge. So they
Mm-hmm.
want to get them at least up to 500 milliliters,
Mm-hmm.
uh, which is about 17 ounces
Mm-hmm.
by 14 days. Uh,
Okay.
750 is full milk production. In
Right.
other words, that's the most milk a baby's going to need during their whole first
About
6 months
25
of
ounces. Mm-hmm.
breastfeeding.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's two different sort of targets there.
Okay. Yeah, well, that makes sense, especially
Yeah.
for those preterm babies that aren't going
Right.
to need that
Right.
25 ounces for a
Right.
while, you know?
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah, yeah. Okay. All right. Well, very interesting. Okay. Well, yeah, let's talk about the research that you found in the study that was interesting to you.
Yeah, so Claire Eden is a lactation consultant I know personally who works in Atlanta, and she published an article in the Journal of Human Lactation where she took a study that was done in the US that really crunched the numbers and sorted out what is the minimum that's needed in order to get to at least that coming to volume 500 milliliters per day for
Mhm.
babies in the NICU. And what it found was that you needed a minimum of 5 to 6 pump sessions per day and a minimum of about 100 well, there's and one of those pump sessions needs to occur between 1 a.m. and 5 a.m. So in other words, sleeping all night isn't going to do it. The longest stretch is a really important piece of this.
Mhm.
So she and her team came up with a a recommendation that they call 5 times 5 early. And what that means is that you want to get up to at least 5 pump sessions per day by day 5, because that seemed to be like the minimum that was needed in order to have milk for the baby, at discharge,
Mhm.
with one pump session between 1 a.m. and 5 a.m. So
Okay.
that seemed to be like among their population, that seemed to be enough to get the milk going initially without overwhelming the parents. Because what
Mhm.
she was finding in her population was telling them to pump 8 times a day. Some of them will pump every 3 hours during the day and then sleep all night. Some of them would pump just sporadically, thinking
Mhm.
eight was just some kind of arbitrary number. And some of them would just give up entirely. So
Mhm.
they were really not getting where they needed to go, much like I mentioned the person who did the review of all the research and decided that nobody was really doing 8 times a
Right.
day. This
Right.
was definitely what they were seeing. And
Mhm.
so they instituted this 5 times 5 early. And that team will also be talking at ILCA about their work. But
Mhm.
it to me, that seemed like a really reasonable place to start.
Well, it's so much more doable.
Right, exactly.
It's so much more achievable,
Right.
because we all know that when you have a new baby, period, life is like, whoa, what's happening?
Mhm.
And so shooting for five
By
in the
day
first
5. But I want
by
to
five. Mhm.
I want to emphasize also that after day 5, you do need to get to try to work in more. Like if you get up to 6 or 7
Mhm.
or even 8, then your odds of actually producing full milk production are greater.
Okay.
So it doesn't mean staying at 5
So it's
because
setting yourself up. If you do that, you're set
right,
up
right.
to achieve full milk production by adding a few extra pumps.
Right. And it's
Okay.
again that first week. So what happens, from day 5 to day 7 could be really critical because
Hmm.
you're still in that 1 week window.
Hmm.
So yeah, the goal is to get up to at least 6 to 7
Hmm.
after day 5.
Okay. All right. Well, and another thing that you found with the research is that where the research took
Mhm.
place and who it took place with
Yes.
very much impacted the research itself.
Right.
So talk a
Right.
little bit about that.
Well, there were three places that I focused on. There was research being done in China, specifically Heidi Fan is a researcher from Hong Kong who actually found that her most recent study showed that 20% of mothers, lactating mothers in Hong Kong are exclusively pumping, which is
Wow.
crazy. I mean,
It's
originally in
really high. Hmm.
the mid 2000s, it was like 4 to 5% in the
Hmm.
US.
Yep.
20% she found. So she does a lot of research around how mothers feel about this. And she discovered that those mothers who were told to pump every 3 hours around the clock, which was a very common
Right.
recommendation, it was a horrible experience. It was tremendously overwhelming. But so
Hmm.
she's one person. There's also other researchers in China who have not really looked at the specifics as closely as some of the others. The second place is the UK.
Hmm.
And there's a researcher named Mary Futrell who has done a lot of research. I've been following her research for decades, but her team, the lead author is Alana Levine, and her studies have really crunched the numbers to look at both number of pump sessions per day and also the longest gap between pump sessions. So her research shows for the first time, this what the longest gap needs to be in order to achieve full milk production. So she did find the longest gap should be no longer than 5 hours.
Okay.
But what was interesting about her study population was her population was mostly middle class and white and healthy.
Hmm.
Whereas in the US, we have these researchers who are developing these high-tech methods uh, for just assessing secretory activation, but
Hmm.
their populations are many of them are primarily Black and
Hmm.
low income. And I'm very familiar with this population because I live in Chicago. And one of my colleagues is Paula Meyer, who had done research over the many decades. I loved her research.
Hmm.
She's also teaming up with some of these researchers. So we've got Rebecca Hoban, who's leading up some of these teams. Leslie Parker is another one, but their populations are different. So here in the United States, to me, one of the most horrible statistics I've ever heard is that 25% of mothers in the US return to work within 2 weeks
Yeah.
after birth because many of the low income mothers, they may be single mothers, they have several part-time jobs, so they have no paid maternity leave through
Yeah.
work. And so
Hmm.
these are the kinds of mothers who are in these studies. And what the researchers found was their study mothers had an average of 3 comorbidities, which are health conditions that can not only affect their well-being, but also can affect lactation. That we're talking about obesity, we're talking about preeclampsia, we're talking about diabetes, we're talking about psychiatric disorders. There's a whole range of them. And this also affects their ability to pump because, for example, if a mother has a serious health problem, preeclampsia, the medication that's given for that can really knock you out and make you to the point where you really can't remember what time it is or what
Yeah.
day it is. And so that obviously can affect your pumping. Um, but also, we know that diabetes can have an effect on delaying secretory activation, obesity. There may be some connection between that and also the responsiveness of the body to the stimulation. And so all of these things are going on with this population, which may be different from what they're seeing in the UK. So I think when we look at the studies,
Hmm.
that's an important thing to consider
We have to think about who these
who the
families
people
are.
are and
Hmm.
what are their situations. Yeah.
Yeah, unfortunately, here in the United States, we do have a lot of comorbidities happening with
Yes.
all moms, but
Yeah.
especially, again, we know with Black mothers are especially challenged with
Right.
comorbidities.
Right.
Okay.
But
Well,
yeah, even with the mothers who have all of these barriers and
mhm,
adversity that they're dealing with, they
mhm,
were still able to make significant milk.
mhm,
What Paula Meyer set up at Rush University Hospital in Chicago were amazing peer support groups.
mhm.
The Mother's Milk Club, she called it. And so they do provide tremendous support, and that helps these mothers provide their milk for the babies, which is wonderful.
Yeah. And going back to work early actually can be a reason that a family chooses to be an exclusive pumper.
Yeah,
Many families are like,
can
well,
be.
why should I bother
It can
even
be.
putting the baby to the breast when I know I'm going to be leaving soon?
Yeah, but even something as simple as, like, for example, in the UK, the pumps were supplied free of
Mm,
charge.
yeah.
And in the US, one of the main problems is that these low-income families are expected to go out and rent a pump. It's not paid for home use. And so something as simple as that can certainly affect someone's ability to pump.
Right. If they are on WIC, then they can get a pump through WIC, but who
Right,
knows exactly which one it will
right,
be. Yeah.
right. And
Yeah.
and not all of them are necessarily on WIC either.
Right.
So
Yeah.
yeah, so there's a lot of factors that affect this. But I like to me, what's most interesting is, some of these minimum numbers that we're beginning to understand.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Did they talk at all, Nancy, about the types of pumps that these
Yeah.
folks were using and
Yeah,
what they found to be most successful?
there was a Chinese study that actually looked at that, and that is a very rare thing. I worked
Mhm.
for a pump company for 8 years.
Yeah.
Typically, you don't see that kind of a comparison
Mhm.
study because most pump companies are more interested in telling you why
Right. They're so great. Yeah.
their improved model is better than their old one, so you don't really see that. But there was a Chinese study that looked at actually, well, what was the difference in milk
Hmm.
yields among mothers who used a multi-user rental model
Hmm.
versus a personal, single user pump. And
Okay.
three groups, and one of them used the multi-user pump for the first 14 days. The other one used it for the first 5 days and then switched over to whatever pump the mother had at home. And then the third group just used the single user pump. And who knows what those were because they weren't
Right.
listed in the
Right.
study.
We didn't get that in details.
They did find that the group that had the best results were the ones who used the multi-user pump for 14 days. And then the one who used it for 5 days had the next best results. And the ones who just used the single user pump had the lowest milk yields.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Nancy, thank you so much for looking into this and doing this research.
It's my job.
It is literally your job.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you
You're
again.
welcome.
And so, thank all of you for listening to All Things Breastfeeding. If you're enjoying our podcast, we'd encourage you to leave us a review so people can find us more easily. And keep your ears open for new research in the future. And yeah, keep your eyes open for Nancy at conferences where she's going to be presenting more details on topics like this.
Yeah.
Nancy, thank you so much for joining us today.
You're welcome. Bye, everyone.
Bye bye.